So now we can go into our landscape, open up the material, and I want to start out with a very fast loading object, sort of a previs tree. For this we want to use one of the older trees, something that's going to load quickly. So I'm going to add in a plant, and I want to select the maple tree, as we had used to initially determine our scale. And now I can click populate, and we can start to see those trees showing up on our terrain. We can increase the density amount to really see just that layer we had set up. We're also using a half scale amount. Our overall scaling is set to 0.5, which is half of real world scale. If we set this up to 1, then we're going to get the actual scale of the objects and the vegetation. Like I was saying earlier in the training, the terrain itself is too small, so we need to have a smaller overall scaling. Either that or setting the scales down smaller on the trees themselves. But since I basically want most things to retain their scale, although we will be making modifications to the General tab scale, I am going to bring this down to 0.4, and we can repopulate, and now we can see this distribution showing up. So this gives us a nice little preview, and we can go ahead and grab our zone if you want to see a different area. Go ahead and move over to the side, and keep in mind our ecosystem is not going to come with, it's going to stay separated. So every time we move the zone control, we need to go back into the material, select our layer, and repopulate. And what I want to do is take our zone and increase its scale on the X and the Y, or with our zone control. And it looks like it gave me a little bit of a problem there, so I'm going to undo that resize. And it looks like that may have kind of messed things up a bit. And it looks like our terrain preview is completely gone. So I'm just going to go back to the last saved version, which is a really good way to recover your scene, which is why you want to save in steps along the way, and also have all of these different controls available. So all we really have to do now is just re-add that maple tree, and we can turn down the scaling again. Go ahead and increase our density. Go to our zone control, scale that up on the X and the Y. So now we can see a much larger area, and then we can repopulate the first layer. So this way we can set up our ecosystem and not have to worry about having the gigantic scene, because we already have a good idea of where the large-scale distribution is. And now we can focus on some of the smaller areas and really kind of figure out our scale and which plants we want to have as part of the ecosystem. So we can select our zone, and let's move over to the side where we start to get some of the higher peaks, and grab our landscape material, go back to layer 1 and repopulate that. And now if we want, we can create just a quick preview render. And we should be able to increase the size of our zone controller quite a ways more without creating too many instances. Although I can tell that I do want to have a slightly smaller ecosystem. I'm going to go back and repopulate that layer. And we're going to take a look and see how this is showing up. I'm going to create another just quick preview render. And these trees are far too large for the ecosystem I have planned. So what I can do is go to the Scaling and Orientation tab and reduce our overall scaling a bit more. And I'm going to repopulate. What I can also do is start to think about the general scale and maybe reducing that as well. The maple tree itself is going to be a fairly good in-between for the larger trees in the scene, meaning it'll give us a really good rough idea of the overall ecosystem and the large trees. Of course, not any of the smaller plants we would have for the close-ups, just kind of the larger stuff. And what we can see is how our decay near foreign objects is also working. And we can fine-tune this if we zoom in a little bit closer. And then we can adjust our fall off. And if we go ahead and open up the material, take a look under density, you can see we have decay near foreign objects on. Our influence is set to 5%. And we have 0 fall off. And these are the default values. One thing I want to do is just increase our sampling quality a little. And I'm going to repopulate. And for the most part, we have a pretty small ecosystem. There's only around 17,000 instances. It still can take a little while to populate it, but definitely much quicker than trying to populate the entire terrain. So right now we're working with a rather large zone, just with a very simple tree. We're not really focusing on the new trees we're going to be bringing in. And what we're going to be doing is picking out kind of the ones we want to have. But first what I want to do is just kind of zoom out a bit, and I'm going to create a render, and we can take a look at the scene so far, and whether or not we need to reduce some of the density settings, if we need to tweak scaling at all. And this is just for, of course, one of our ecosystem layers. We, of course, have several more. So I'm going to set up a little bit of a render. Just kind of positioning this. Of course, the edges are cut off from our terrain, but it'll give us a good rough idea of how this is going to look with these trees, because sometimes the OpenGL preview can be larger than the tree itself, and it might not be a good enough representation of what the tree scale is going to be, and especially density, because around these areas it looks like everything's really cluttered together, when in fact there could be a lot of spacing between those trees. So I'm just going to set this to the final render, and I want to make this a little bit larger. So I'm going to type in 1280, and I'm using the Academy Standard Flat. And now if you want the really fine detail to show up, you'll want to set it to broadcast mode. I'm just going to keep it in final right now. It should be more than enough to really tell how this is going to look. So we'll go ahead and render this out, and then we can see how our ecosystem currently looks. And by taking a look at the render, this is definitely the scale I had intended for the ecosystem, and the density looks pretty good overall, considering we're going to be swapping out and having different types and different vegetation species. I do like this layer, and now what we can do is move on to the other ecosystem layers and take a look at how the density looks with those. So go ahead and close this out, and I am just going to clear from our first layer. And we're going to go into our second layer, and we're going to add in a plant, and we're going to use the maple tree again. And I want to set our overall scaling to be the exact same. So we can set that to 0.2. Our density, we'll also go ahead and crank that up a little more. And now we can populate. And we'll be able to see our layer 2 density. And we're not really seeing much for this area of the terrain. So what we can do is select our zone control, and move this over. Go back to our landscape, select our second layer. I'm going to clear it first and repopulate. And it doesn't look like it had registered the new terrain data. So I'm just going to shift this over a little bit more. And see if we can get that to refresh. And it looks like it's still using the edge of where the terrain was before. So I'm going to increase our sampling quality, our density, click OK. Now what we can do is select the landscape itself, edit the object, just let it refresh in the terrain editor, click OK. And now go back and repopulate. Now this could be just the way the fractal is going to look. I'm going to undo the movement I just made. Go back to our zone and just reposition it a little. Pull that back. And just make sure that the X and Y are matching up for both the zone and the landscape, just to make sure I didn't accidentally move the landscape itself rather than the zone. And we'll try that again, repopulate, and see what this area of the terrain looks like. And it looks like this is just one of the sparse density layers, although that line is a little too defined, so it may be a problem with the terrain itself or with the zone object. What I'm going to do is go ahead and just go back into our material. We're going to clear this out and take a look at our layer 3. And just kind of set up the same settings as before. And let's go ahead and populate. And this is one of our layers, and one of the layers I set up for the low altitude areas. That's going to be very close to the water. So this one we will need to really watch the decay near foreign objects and make sure that it's not going into the water. And we might need to take a look at the main camera preview in order to really tell, just because our zone might be intersecting with some of the ecosystem layers. And it's possible sometimes with infinite planes the preview in the OpenGL might be off a little, even though we're not actually looking at it. We did run into an issue before where we did have a hidden object causing an error in the scene. So it looks like from the preview, I don't see any problems with it going into the water, and it does look like the water is actually lower than it is appearing in the OpenGL. And we may need to just modify the zone preview. We're going to select the water object, and we can definitely tell. I'm going to turn off hidden, select our zone control, and move that down so we can see the actual water line, because it looks like the z-axis did get moved. And now we can re-hide our water. So now we can fine-tune that decay near foreign object a little bit better. And even though our zone is not supposed to influence our decay, sometimes it will do it anyway. So I'm going to go back and repopulate layer 3. I'm also not going to hit clear this time, just in case that caused that issue before, or maybe it looked like it was not refreshing correctly. But it looks like that decay is showing up just fine. So now what I can do is go to our density for layer 3, increase the density, and I'm going to decrease the influence of our decay near foreign objects down to 2%, which I'm going to type in the value and repopulate. And we may need to increase the sampling quality to get some more of this along the water's edge, but for the most part it looks pretty good. We might want to increase the density a little, depending on what the overall amount of ecosystem we want in those areas. So now I just want to take a quick look at number 4. So we're going to clear out layer 3, go into layer 4, add in, once again, the fast rendering maple tree, and quick loading as well. And since we already have it loaded into the other layers, that is part of the memory, and we don't have to worry about any sort of hang-up time while loading that in. So it looks like this is set up right. We can set our scaling to 0.2 like the other layers and populate layer 4. And if we take a look, this one is basically the same as layer 3, and I did set it up that way so that I had 2 with the same type of control. One of them has the noise built into the density, and one of them is just purely the environment tab settings. And that way we could break up the ecosystem a little bit more if needed. I'm going to move our zone control so that we can see this full sort of pond lake area. And I'm going to repopulate layer 4, and now we can see the distribution around this entire body of water. And now we could move the zone around a little bit more if we wanted to. It looks like view may not be recognizing the change. What we might have to do is just close out the scene, reopen it. I'm going to create a new save, C number 9, and save that out. And next what we're going to be doing is taking a look and picking out the vegetation we want for our ecosystem. Basically picking out the trees we want for our forest, and we're going to be doing this in a separate scene, and then also creating some of the variations we want from the main plant species.